Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, wherever you may be. Good day. My name is Michelle Magalong, and welcome to the Preservation by All for All session for this year's Women in Preservation Symposium. I want to first give an acknowledgement to the Smithsonian and NSCDA for hosting today's symposium. So thank you and welcome to everyone. I am coming from the University of Maryland, and which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Piscataway people. I acknowledge the painful history and legacies of genocide, forced displacement from this territory. And I ask that we pay our respects to the many diverse indigenous peoples and lands we are still connected to these places on which we gather today virtually. So again, hello and welcome. My name is Michelle Magalong, and I will be serving as two roles today, as a presenter, but also your moderator. So before we kick off today's session, Preservation for All, by All, I just want to do some quick check-ins. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them on the Q&A box, and we'll address them later at the end of a series of questions that we've created to pose for each of our panelists. And for those who are streaming on Facebook, I apologize, I can't see your questions. So hopefully the wonderful tech support we have, if they're able to see any questions that may come up on Facebook, they'll drop it in the Q&A for us to see. And so I want to introduce my panelists that I am very honored to have join with me today for this session. And so I'm actually going to ask them to introduce themselves. And I'm going to first start off with Ty.
Hello, my name is Ty Ginter. My pronouns are they, them. I apologize for the mask. I'm currently at my day job, and so I have to stay masked because of the pandemic. But so I am the founder of DC Diaries, which is an oral history and memory mapping project located in Washington, DC, that looks to document and preserve the histories of the lesbian and sapphic community in Washington, DC.
Great, Ty. And you are an alum.
I am a University of Maryland alum, so that's fun. And I'm coming to you from, I'm also coming from the lands of the Piscataway people, just up the road.
Thank you, Ty. And then next I'm gonna have Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Gould. Firstly, my pronouns are she, her, and I am a public historian based in San Antonio, Texas, ancestral homes to a number of different people from the Cabiltecan peoples. And I'm currently interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute here in San Antonio, which is an organization dedicated to documenting, preserving, and disseminating Mexican American civil rights history. I'm also co-founder and co-chair of Latinos and Heritage Conservation, a nonprofit founded in 2014 to increase Latino representation in historic preservation, and also an organization greatly influenced by APIA HIP, organization that Michelle leads.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And we have Monica.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. My name is Monica Montgomery. It's great to meet you, exchange with you, and learn from you. My pronouns are she and her. I am a consulting curator of social justice programs and projects with the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building and co-founder and strategic director of Museum Hue. I identify as a museum activist, curating, speaking, teaching, leading, doing all these things to surface Black Lives Matter and other social justice movements in museums. And it's great to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Ty, Sarah, and Monica. And, I am, again, very humbled to just be in this space with the three of you. My name is Michelle Magalong, as you heard some little glimpses of who I am or I am identified with. First, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am president of a volunteer organization called Asian and Pacific Islanders in Historic Preservation, API HIP, which was founded in 2007. All volunteer based. We're a national organization focused on elevating the stories and places associated with Asian and Pacific Islander Americans across the United States and US territories. And I have a second hat. Like Ty, our day jobs are in Maryland. So my job, I am a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Maryland. So, and so I identify, as Monica had modeled, I identify as a planning preservationist. My training is in urban planning, and not formally trained in preservation, but just through all the grassroots work that I've been an honor to be a part of. So I see myself as a planning preservationist, activist scholar. And so with that, the first question I have for each of us to share is about your own work and a recent and current work that shine the light on issues of intersectionality, right? As we think about gender, place, heritage, and equity. So first, I would like to invite Sarah.
Yeah, well, so I am also not trained as a historic preservationist. I come from a museum background and I've worked in museums for about 20 years. But I became involved in historic preservation through grassroots work, especially here in San Antonio through the Westside Preservation Alliance, which is a grassroots organization working to preserve a very notable Mexican-American working class neighborhood here called the Westside. And I'm just going to share a couple of images with you to talk about that work. Right now, I've been involved in efforts to save a very iconic public housing complex in the Westside, the Alazan Apache Courts, also known as Los Courts. They were built during the era of segregation, and so they were built specifically to house Mexican Americans. And let me just show you the next slide here. There we go. Their construction replaced substandard housing that contributed to massive public health disparities here faced by Mexican Americans. And when they were constructed, they essentially forced the city to introduce basic infrastructure, like connecting water to the Westside, like creating a sewage connection to the Westside. And so their construction really changed the community in huge ways in terms of bringing in that basic infrastructure. I want to just tell you that public housing is very much a women's issue. And so when I think about why is it important to save the Alazan Apache Courts, it's not just about saving Mexican-American history, although it certainly is about saving Mexican-American history. The courts were also designed by a very important architect here in San Antonio. So there's the architecture story, there's the meaning to the Mexican-American community here. But also this is very much about women's history and the ongoing needs of women in our community. In these early photos, or these photos from the early days of Los Courts, you see how women's roles as caretakers of their families and of their communities are really being emphasized by this photographer who worked for the San Antonio Housing Authority. Even to this day, this is still true today, the majority of people served by public housing are single moms and their kids. So today, here, this is for courts. Today, the Alazan Apache Courts is home to about 1,200 residents, a vibrant community right next to downtown, which makes it very attractive real estate. The majority of the households are headed by single moms. Over half of the residents of the courts are under the age of 18, so a lot of kids. And despite the fact that there continues to be a waiting list for public housing in San Antonio, it was announced that this was all going to be demolished to create mixed income development. Demolition of the courts would not only bring a loss of something that is architecturally significant, but also this loss of a deeply embedded community, scattering families to the winds and removing large numbers of children from the area public schools. And in fact, I think it could potentially threaten the very existence of the public schools in this neighborhood, while of course paving the way for gentrification that has already taken over other downtown adjacent neighborhoods. Fortunately, last year, the National Trust for Historic Preservation did name the Alizon Apache Courts among their annual 11 most endangered. But I would just tell you that public housing is something that I hope all historic preservationists are thinking about, because this story is not unique to San Antonio. Public housing is under attack across the United States, and it does overwhelmingly serve women.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for showing just such great slides too, right, of the place. So I would like to ask Ty to share your own work and current projects.
Yeah, so like I said, I'm the founder of DC Diaries, and we are an oral history and memory mapping project documenting lesbian and sapphic spaces in Washington, DC. And it really grew out of sort of my thesis looking at the oldest continually operating lesbian bar, Phase 1, which was located on 8th Street Southeast in Washington, DC, and really trying to understand. It sort of came out as a project of trying to preserve the bar because the bar had been closed. The bar was closed, and it was the last lesbian space in the city. And so when it closed, it really created this, there was this lack of spaces for lesbians in the city and for sapphic women in the city. And there was also, it was a lack of community gathering space. And so it was really trying to record the history before it went away completely. But it was also a project to document other spaces that were open at the time of the phase, which was between 1971 and 1971 and 2016. And then from there, also comparing and contrasting locations that rose and fell during the phase while the phase was open, to try to figure out why it was open for so long, why it lasted for so long, and hopefully being able to take some of those lessons and apply them to spaces that still exist today. So like recently, 2 years ago, we had 2 lesbian spaces open up in the city again, or their build is queer spaces, but for all intents and purposes, they are mostly sapphic centered. But so some of the things we were able to pull from Dykaries for this thesis, I was able to sort of give to the community and be like, this is what worked in the past. It may not work in the future, but like there is no downside to trying it. And because we have 2 spaces of a league of our own, and we had another space, XX Plus, but currently it's closed. And one of the things we found through my thesis was that one of the reasons the lesbian bar phase lasted for so long was because it was connected to a larger gay male establishment that was keeping it afloat. And so right now, a league of our own is attached to a larger bar, a gay bar, Pitchers. And right now, Pitchers is keeping it open during the pandemic, and we're really hoping, because a lot of these other lesbian spaces we see every single day across the country, that lesbian spaces are closing. And so we're really, really hopeful that spaces like the phase, or like a league of our own, which are attached to a larger club, will be able to stick around and stay open. And some of the other work that's being done through Dykaries is sort of calling out transphobia and racism in the lesbian and sapphic community as well. We have a huge problem, especially in the district, but nationwide, of racist and transphobic practices being held against trans men, non-binary folks, Black, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander people who come to lesbian spaces trying to find community, and instead they find the same racism and bigotry that they find everywhere else. So it's really an attempt to document that and not see the community through rose-colored glasses, which is a huge problem as well. And to say we have this problem in the future, let's maybe try to go forward and not be such jerks to the rest of our community. So that's the goal of Dykaries. And so right now we're finishing up that first round of transcriptions. So we've looked at 8 8 or so bars, clubs, restaurants, and sort of got a bunch of oral history information, got memory mapping. So right now, all that stuff, we're transcribing it. We're getting it ready for archivization with the Rainbow History Project, which is the local gay archive. And as soon as all of that is submitted to the Rainbow History Project, we're going to start phase 2. So we're going to start documenting more spaces. We're going to start going through the archives. We're going to start memory mapping. We're going to start oral history collection again. And thankfully, the pandemic has sort of allowed us to sort of take that time to do the transcription, because it's harder to do oral history project interviews like over Zoom. It's just like hard, especially because if you're in person, you have to wear masks, you can't do it. So like, thankfully the pandemic has sort of allowed us, even though we are in a race against time, especially because of the gentrification in the city, it's sort of allowed us to sort of take a step back and be able to sort of get the transcription and the archivists and the archival information ready to be submitted.
Wow. So much going on. There's
a lot.
And your day job. So
and my day job, which is in construction. So
right, for all of us, right? Like, and our day jobs, right? Yeah. And so I would like to invite Monica to share with us the work you're working on.
Sure. And I'm going to ask the powers that be to pull up some slides to share. I'm really in this, as they're doing that, I'm in this really interesting space of curating a massive exhibition on behalf of the Smithsonian with a team of others, as well as working on passion projects that really intersect with social justice, preservation, and just kind of community care. So as they pull that up, I can share more about my projects. And I will start sharing. Remind me, am I supposed to see the slides or no? No? Yes.
I don't see them up yet. So
okay, that's okay. I'm going to just start sharing and we're going to rock out.
Okay.
So, okay. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry about that. I just want to make sure that I'm in the right place. Okay. I'm going to start sharing. I don't see them. No worries.
Yeah.
So I am really excited to be a consulting curator for the Arts and Industries Building, which is the newest the newest unit of the Smithsonian Institution, opening to the public later this November. And certainly we are telling stories around, of, and with the future. And Futures is the name of the exhibit. So in this work, we're opening this historically preserved building. The Arts and Industries Building was the first U.S. National Museum. It opened in 1881 as the National Museum and the second oldest Smithsonian building. And this was this radical moment in Smithsonian history as this first purpose-built museum space that housed early inventions and citizen science and incubated many other museums. And now with this exhibit, we are telling the story of a hopeful future, a sustainable future, an equitable future, not a dystopian future, which is a pretty gallant and valiant thing to do. And we're really looking as this to be the 175th anniversary exhibit, telling this pan-institutional story of the Smithsonian's efforts as an engine of the future. We're highlighting 15 other museums and research units, and we have input from hundreds of SI-wide colleagues as we consider this legacy of preservation and innovation, looking at the past, what's went well, what can go better, and how that translates to the future. Just so you all know, this exhibit will be open in November 2021, and we're really fusing art and technology and design and history to invite visitors to dream with us, not imagining one future, but many possible futures on the horizon. This exhibit that I am co-curating and curating with others has more than half of the objects, ideas, and installations created by women, BIPOC persons, LGBTQ+ persons, or persons with different abilities. And that's about 150 objects in our installations, and are centering around these themes of inspiring, working, uniting, and ultimately that the future is not a fact. It is a decision built by individual and collective choices. So really excited to be doing that work. Stay tuned for us. I want to also jump into some other projects. So you can go to the next slide. So as an independent curator who's really been centering Black history, Black futures, Black lives, this has been my passion, working with historic spaces, historic houses, any sort of space that is looking to tell their story more fully. Sometimes when we think of historic sites, it's kind of the story of that patriarchal hero or the enslaver or the colonizer. But I really enjoy working with Black spaces that have this full history to tell. So this exhibit, Forward Ever, Sacred Ground, Sovereign Space, and the adjacent public history exhibit In Pursuit of Freedom Now was done at Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York. And it was really great to work with them as they tell the story of being one of the major freedom cities where people who were enslaved, as well as people who were running, from slavery, as well as people who were free, would all converge to be a part of this freedom colony where you would come, you would get treated well, they would welcome you in the community, they'd give you land and give you a chance to go to school and a chance to work. And this was just like unheard of at the time, but really Weeksville, which is a place in Brooklyn, New York, grew to be this massive freedom colony, and the neighborhood still appreciates and reflects that history today. Next slide. So in this work, it's been really exciting to see the history of Weeksville from the times where they were championing for better treatment for Black citizens in the days where race riots were like sweeping the land and there was a lot of terror, racial terror, to the civil rights movement, to today's Black Lives Movement, and how I was able to curate this in a way that shows past to present and situating the site, being very site specific. Next slide. Just more great inspiration from this exhibit. We fused art, we had the history, we had the site where you could do tours of the Weeksville houses and understand that neighborhood and the importance of it and how it still inspires us today. Next slide. So it was really exciting to see that. And then from that work, just pivoting really quickly into another project I was a part of, I curated a series called the Pilgrimage Project, which really looked at how do Black people who oftentimes don't have the privilege of having a long, extensive family tree, how do they envision freedom and liberation and tracing a family for themselves? Next slide. So kind of imagining these roots and wings of Black freedom in a time of jeopardy, looking at the journey of escaping slavery and bondage. Next slide. And using archives and story and photo and research to explore historic Black life and how that might be recast or depicted as a space of freedom-seeking, liberation, and genealogy. So it was inspired by this evocative nature of ancestry, gaps in family trees, people not knowing their full names, where their family was taken to when they were ripped away. Next slide. To looking at these spaces and this kind of plotting out where you could go if you were an enslaved Black person seeking freedom. Weeksville being one of the spaces, which I just talked about, going to the Woodlawn Mansion, which was a former plantation turned kind of radical social experiment of a farm in Virginia, and how that can be a space, or one of the contraband camps around the time of the Civil War in DC. Next slide. So how are all these paths that people would take lead them in a way of freedom? And we took modern photography, took in by two artists I worked with, to kind of reimagine what those sites look like and what that path looked like. Next slide. So it was really exciting as a curator and someone who loves history and someone who likes to almost reimagine images that don't exist, how we could take and juxtapose these around one another, thinking about freedom, historic sites, genealogy. Next slide. And beyond. So this was just a sample, small list of some of the enslaved Africans that were and worked at Woodlawn, and wondering, more about their ancestry and if they could trace it, what that would look like. And we were able to get some archival images and really think of all three of these sites. Next slide. I think, okay, I'm going to stop there. You can take the slides down. So those are three projects in quick form that I'm working on that center preservation, but preservation and beyond, and how that really roots the community in the process.
Wonderful, Monica. Thank you so much. And I'll wrap up this first question with just some work that I've been doing. And yeah, I'm going to share in the chat. So this is the work I do with API HIP. One of the things we do, similar to what Ty had mentioned about online mapping, we have a crowdsourced mapping project through History Pin called East at Main Street, which was started in 2013. And we use it as a way to invite folks to share their, material objects, histories, any other, kind of artifacts and about a place that's important to them, right? That tell our stories as Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. So East at Main Street, has been something that we get to use to see, like, what are, how do we broaden and expand the terms, right, of just telling our stories, documenting our places, and elevating them on an online platform. So, I share a link of the Japanese YWCA in San Francisco to not only show you what we're doing at East Main Street, but we use it as an advocacy tool. So the Japanese YWCA was recently added on, listed to the National Register last year. Today, in a few hours, I'm going to jump onto another Zoom for the city of San Francisco, as the Board of Supervisors are going to be hearing a landmark nomination at the local level for the Japanese YWCA. And the Japanese YWCA is not only associated with Japanese American women, as it was created for Japanese American women who were excluded or not allowed to use other YWCAs in the city, right? So they raised money to provide this space, and then when they were incarcerated during World War II, there were the neighbors who took over the space and helped, take care of the space. And it has a very wonderful layered history, so many histories, not only for its association with Japanese American women, but also there is, it's a space for civil rights for African Americans and the LGBTQ community in San Francisco. It's located in Japantown, right? So it talks about all these intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, things, and now it's a childcare facility listed on the legacy business registry for San Francisco, right? So it's just so dynamic of a space. And so, I'm thrilled to not only speak later on today to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, but last week, San Francisco's planning department internally, they had a equity resolution, social equity resolution that they passed last year. And part of the work is they wanted to do this equity in action series for their own planning staff, right? And for them to hear about what does equity in action look like. And so I was thrilled to be their first speaker last week, just to talk to the planning staff of what does equity look like when we do preservation planning, right? And so I was fortunate to talk more about the Japanese YWCA, thinking I was maybe preaching to the choir, and I ended up finding out that, like many of the planning department folks, they're not all in preservation. They may be in transportation, they may be in affordable housing or economic development, right? Don't know about these places that are not only about preservation, but they're about like quality of life issues, as Sarah had mentioned, right? So they're not just pretty buildings with plaques, put onto them, right? But they still serve many needs of the neighborhoods and of the places and of the people, right? And that, to even tie it to the work I do here at University of Maryland in the Historic Preservation Program, I'm currently teaching a graduate seminar on race and ethnic issues in historic preservation. But for me, it's not just about race and ethnic issues. It's also about gender, it's about sexuality, it's about class, right? And I use the Japanese YWCA as one of those examples of how do we look at our work, right? And so those are just some of I was thinking about the Japanese YWCA. I was like, that's just kind of captures the projects I've been working on as of late, right? And particularly at the core of it is that it's a place where women were denied, access and services, right? But has also become or remains a beacon of resilience, right? And that we talk about the resiliency not only of women, just as people, as very dynamic, complicated layers that we all kind of reside in, right? So thank you, each of you, for sharing. I mean, it's just amazing work. As you could see in the chat, we're getting a lot of questions. So, so if you feel compelled, you could type, your responses as the panelists as we go through these. But I know we still have a few more questions to tackle, including how does critical gender and race theories inform your work and practice? As you've started to already, we've started to kind of unpack already. So first, I would like to invite Monica to answer that question.
Thank you so much, Michelle. In many, many ways. So, as an African American woman who that believes that Black history, Black future, and Black lives matter, I try to root that in everything that I do throughout my curatorial practice, throughout my historic site work, my DEI, anti-racism work, and every other facet of work. I'm always seeking out these moments, both formally and informally, through institutions and cultural spaces and historic spaces to address the roots and the role of racism, of this season of racial reckoning, and how to advance a social justice equity agenda on behalf of all involved, looking at staff and stakeholders and audiences. So I'm kind of working at these intersections of counter narrative, looking at critical race theory, community care, which is a theory that I am developing based on others who have done that work, and creative placemaking. The way that I'm defining community care is an architecture of practice that honors empathy and advocacy and social responsibility in service of our society. So when institutions at their best, when things are running optimally, and even when they aren't, when they strive to enact community care, that might look like offering opportunities for neighbors to engage in courageous conversations, or really mining and looking at the archives, at the origin stories, and the histories that are being told, and what is missing and what needs to be remedied and what needs to be added in. I see museums like the Walters really grappling with the history of Confederate founders and other kind of racial tensions in their story, and publicly releasing those findings to start a conversation and to advance a racial equity agenda. Community care can look like strong partnerships or collaborations. It could look like a space that might be a convener space, bringing folks together to talk and look and listen, or even a space of resistance, expanding those interpretations, speaking truth to power, speaking out on behalf of audiences, and decolonizing practices. So that's kind of that realm of community care. Of course, creative placemaking, or I won't say, of course, some of us know it, but the term that I use, the definition I use, is from the USDAC, which is not a government organization. It stands for the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. It's kind of a reimagined way of approaching arts and culture. And that's looking at creative placekeeping as this process of community development. It's leveraging the outside, the public, the private, the nonprofit funds, and resources to shape and change narratives, whether that's the physical character of a neighborhood or infusing these artful interventions into those activities. So I always feel like we can bring art and culture and history together. And then just generally thinking about counter narrative, right? This concept through critical race theory that engages visitors in enacting their own interpretations of a better, more just, inclusive future, giving them the agency, letting them speak and have that truth telling and that storytelling in spaces and out of spaces. So those three inform my practice. And I do think I'm going to skip the slides in the interest of time, but I've been involved in projects and curated spaces that are using those as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monica. Next, I would like to invite Ty.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, a lot of the work that I do, especially, is informed. So I got my degree at University of Maryland. I got an undergraduate degree in a lot of that gender theory, and then I got a master's degree in preservation. And so a lot of the way that coming to Dykaries as someone who does have that preservation background is really wanting to be able to share that information with the public, because not everyone has the resources, not everyone has the ability to go out and get a preservation degree. No one has the ability to necessarily go out and even get an undergraduate degree. So really, it's really the way I sort of approach Dykaries is really sharing that information with the public as much as possible, making things as accessible as possible, and really sort of decolonizing sort of the institutions of learning around preservation and sharing that with the public, so that even if they don't have the resources to go or the time to go out and get a preservation degree, they can still move forward with that information and preserving their own communities. And that can look like, for us, working with Rainbow History Project on workshops on how, like, this is how you archive your stuff if you want to. This is how you go about. I've lost my train of thought, but it's really just about sharing that information as much as possible, making things as accessible as possible, and really also calling out a lot of LGBTQ heritage right now is very nervous about calling the community in, and being like, hey, like we have a racism problem in our community, we have a transphobia problem in our community. And even like, because the LGBTQ community is this huge like nexus point of all of these little like circles that are been squished together just because we are all gender or sexually involved with folks. So we all have problems, all of our circles have problems, and then we get together all like into the big circle, those all have problems. So it's really about sort of separating those circles and having those circles work on their own stuff. So as a lesbian, or as someone who works in lesbian and static spaces, that's really talking about racism in our community, that's really talking about transphobia in our community, and biphobia as well. And really making sure that when you are recording spaces, you are creating space for respondents and for oral history applications, or folks who are participating in oral histories, to have space to share that information, so that information can be archived, and so that information can go out to the public and be like, this is a problem that we're having, and just shedding light on that. Because otherwise, if people don't feel safe to share that information, it's never going to get told, and the problem is going to persist.
Thanks, Ty. Yeah, I mean, you just bring up a key issue, right? How do you unpack when we've been just like, I don't know, our acronyms are all just pushed together, right? Because it's of convenience, right? Like we're monolithic identities, even within that one identity of, it may be gender and sexuality, may it be race, ethnicity, right? It's all just smushed together, like you all get along, right?
And the overlapping layers can just get
right. And unpacking that is really difficult. So, Sarah, would you like to share about how critical gender and race theory may inform your work?
Yeah, both in my museum work and in my preservation work, thinking about decolonizing is very important. But to me, there's the decolonizing aspect of it, which then takes you into thinking about intersectionality, right? Because you mentioned this earlier, Michelle, but when we start to think about what are these boxes that we have been put into, and where did they come from, and right, we all know they're fake, right? So as we start dismantling those ideas, I hope that what we see is the ways that we are connected, or the ways that even if we don't feel that connected, that we have similar struggles. And so that's when the intersectionality becomes incredibly key, as well as a move to thinking about solidarity movements. And I know that over the decades, we've had so many attempts, some of them successful, at solidarity movements, but I would love to see a greater emphasis on solidarity movements within that whole umbrella of public history. Latinos are these, often call ourselves mestizos or whatever you want to say, but we're often in the intersections ourselves as people who can be of multiple races, as people who in some cases trace our ancestry to what is now the United States, and in other cases are more recent immigrants, and yet we all have these sort of common threads, not necessarily always getting along, but still we have some common threads. And so I do think a lot about that. I also just want to harken back to just some old school cultural theory and thinking about capital, including social capital and cultural capital. Who has it? Whose cultural and social capital is actually acknowledged, and whose is not, and why? And so those are things that I think about a lot in terms of the powers that are shaping our work, and how do we disrupt that?
Yes, thank you. And even Sarah, like whose capital is monetized and valued, right? And sold and purchased and consumed by whom? And these are not critical theories. These are like long-rooted cultural, theories that we've all had to, just like decolonizing our minds is not something new, right? It's not all of a sudden critical race theory came on. but it's something that, even gender studies, ethnic studies as disciplines, are long rooted. The official start being like in the 60s during the civil rights, but it's something that's been, long studied, but, interesting to me. I guess from my point of view too, to further this is who writes these stories, right? Who publishes these stories? Who has access to these stories? And, this is my quick plug for a book that, an edited volume that came out through Columbia University on preservation and social inclusion. I was invited. I use the word invited because that's what it was. It wasn't an open call, but I was invited to share the story of the work that we do at API HIP, right? So who has access, right, to share our stories, even in preservation education, right? And how do I even place myself not only as a writer, but just my different intersectionalities, right? Identifying as an Asian American woman, identifying as a Filipino American woman, identifying as, a child of immigrants, right? A daughter of immigrants, working class family, not even, how do we even look at it being not just BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, but like, what does it look like to be Black, Indigenous women of color, right? And how we tell our stories in here. And that's how, I think we're fortunate to be at this place, standing on the shoulders of many giants in terms of activists and scholars, right? Who we get to, shed light to their stories and place them in preservation. Because for me, a lot of this work has been happening outside the traditional norms of preservation, right? Big P preservation, right? Versus little p, I say little p is like on the ground, right? In the margins, right? So that's how I, these issues of intersectionality, it's not new. It didn't just start happening in the last year or so, right? But I think for many of us, this is how we've just this is our lived experience, right? Understanding, like, when you talk about women's rights, when we ask ourselves, what about other parts of ourselves, right? What other rights are denied about us? And so, another just plug of the work that I've done in this time, just a few months ago, January, University of Maryland, we got to host a research symposium called Recentering the Margins. Sarah was one of our speakers, right? To me, the thing that kind of the light bulb that came onto in my mind when the university asked me, like, what would it look like? What would your research look like here doing your postdoc? And I was just like, I just want not just me, but everyone else that I've seen on the ground in conference rooms and at certain just random meetings, to get their voices heard, right? Because when you look them up in Google Scholar, you look it up in the preservation curriculum, you don't see their voices, you don't see their work, right? And they're saying, well, because they're not getting published. And I'm like, well, let me call that out. How many of us have PhDs, right? But have chosen or have not been given opportunity to be in preservation, education, the formal tradition, right? And so for me, it's like, how do we even give voice to ourselves in traditional preservation education and practice when we've felt like, people get us in other places, right? Or we're not even invited. And so those are some of the, kind of the ways that to popularize gender and race theory, I don't need to talk about it, versus how do we act on it, right? How do we navigate it through those lenses? So the next question, we've brought it up a little bit, touched on it about just the pandemics, right? What's been happening with cascading crises, may they be viral, racial, political, economic, climate issues. How has that impacted the way you understand gendered issues and histories in your work? And how has that impacted your scholarship and your work? And so I actually want to just speak real quick. I know The shootings in Georgia 3 weeks ago still resonate for many folks, right? And it's not the first time we've heard about anti-Asian racism and violence, right? But it's the latest of tragic examples of anti-Asian violence that has been documented across the nation. This crime also speaks about how Asian American and Pacific Islander women have been fetishized, sexualized, commodified, and marginalized in ways that has made us or them vulnerable to exploitation and violence. And really how places associated with Asian and Asian American women and women's work have historically been stigmatized and targeted by law enforcement, as seen as in raids of opium dens and brothels and ethnic enclaves during the early 20th century, to the unhealthy, unsafe work environments, including in spas and sweatshops, speaks to the need to address the vulnerability of women and people overall in these spaces. And so I can imagine for so many of us, this past year has been difficult, right? It's paused some of our work, but it's also increased a lot of other parts of our work. I don't know how many statements I've had to write, in the last 12 months. Most recently, we had to write a statement on the shootings in Atlanta. But also a year ago, we had to write about the fears of being targeted because of what was known as, we were saying the coronavirus, it was being called other things by people in power here in DC, right? And many of us in the Asian American community were afraid because this isn't the first time we were targeted, right? And here at the University of Maryland, I was able to host a webinar on the pandemic of hate, that it has a long history in Asian American communities. Particularly, I spoke to scholars who have looked at gender, race, and public health crises in Asian American spaces in Los Angeles and San Francisco's Chinatown. And so those are the ways that I have in my work at Maryland and with API HIP have had to address these many layers of crises and pandemics in the last year. And so I would like to ask Ty if you can, share with how these pandemics and crises have informed your work.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit earlier about how the pandemic has sort of given us the opportunity to sort of do some work that sort of was on the back burner. It sort of has given us the ability to sit down and actually do transcriptions, sit down and do archive work that otherwise may or may not be lost in the sort of the mad rush to collect history before it disappears off the face of the earth in some cases. But also it's really, the past year has really sort of influenced a lot of the way that I just approach preservation, making sure that all of the resources that I can share, especially as a white person, as much information I can give if people want to, if they want to have it, if they want to, if they would like, if I can decolonize academia a little bit and be able to share resources as much as possible. That's really what I'm trying to do. I'm really trying to uplift Black lesbian voices, especially because a lot of the work that is done in the LGBTQ community is very white-centered. So it's really about uplifting those voices, making people aware of the other projects that are going on that might not be getting the support that's real and that other spaces might be getting. And also just like as someone who does work in construction, sort of to go into this other little facet of my life for a second, watching the coronavirus, sort of watching all these like people in preservation who are very white, middle class, they get to work from home a lot of the time. And the folks in my industry, we don't get to work from home. And a lot of the people in my who work for my company are Latinx, they're Black, they're Asian, and these people are proportionately out at construction sites. They're interacting with people every single day, and the pandemic is affecting them at much higher rates than other places. But I'm still seeing folks, especially in Maryland, which is where I currently am. mostly white people are getting vaccinated because they are the ones who can call the lines. They're the ones who can sit at home. They're not on a job site where phones aren't allowed from 6:30 in the morning to whenever they get off. Sometimes they're working 10, 12-hour days. And so all these folks who are sitting at home can call up the hotline at any time or get on the website and just make an appointment. And then they have the time off to go out to one of the max vaccination sites and they can get vaccinated. People in my industry, they don't have that time off. They can't, some cases, they don't have transportation. So it's things like this that have really sort of, I was already radical before, but I got even more radicalized. I think a lot of folks have gotten more radicalized, but it's just things like that which really need to inform preservation going forward, because it's the people who make the world turn, and we need to stick up for them.
Thank you, Ty. Thank you for giving voice to what you're seeing in preservation construction work. I would like to now invite Sarah to share what your experiences are.
I really relate to what Ty said about the pandemic making me a little bit more radical. Before my position that I'm in now, I was founding director of the Museo del Westside, a community participatory museum that was still in infancy, creating this museum by, for, and about the West Side. And that's a community that has a huge digital divide. So when the pandemic hit and we had to go to virtual, my audience got disconnected really quickly. My audience was also really hurt by the pandemic due to loss of jobs, due to also the fact that so many working class Latinos are essential workers who cannot work remotely. And of course, this virus seems to attack a lot of people who have pre-existing conditions, which are very, very prevalent in communities of color, including Latino communities. So my community was under attack. My community was disconnected. It made me angry and sad, of course. But so I was actually on the board of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute at the time, and our former director needed to go back to his full-time job of teaching. And so this opportunity came up for me, and it did seem like an opportunity to really put more of my energy into focusing on not only all of the civil rights work that Mexican Americans have done for the past century plus, but also what's happening to us right now, and bring more attention to that. Because, whether we're talking about state violence against people of color, or we're talking about just random people on the street violence against people of color. Unfortunately, our communities, and this is again where solidarity comes up, we've been experiencing this for centuries. And I feel that this pandemic has made it sort of come to a head of enough is enough. So I really do think that, I hope that this pandemic, if anything positive comes out of this horrible devastation, it's that we are more sensitive to how we treat each other, I hope.
Thank you, Sarah. Monica?
Yes. Yes, and high five to everything that has been said, and the ways that oftentimes people like us on this panel and those who are our colleagues, family, and friends have been marginalized and demeaned and denigrated throughout these pandemics. The victims have borne the brunt of the heaviness, of the pain, of the loss. I myself am one of those people looking for a vaccination and struggling to find one. And so it resonates deeply. And I feel like the dual pandemics of, racism and certainly the public health crisis and all the other crises that are happening, it's made myself, my colleagues, and my clients so much more conscious of our humanity, of our frailty, and this transformative power of mutual aid. And what does it mean to see each other? I love when I see articles or see crowdsourced funds that are sharing around on how can we celebrate and support those who have lost, those who have lost jobs, contracts, artists who have lost work, community members who have lost. I think that mutual aid element is one of the only silver linings of all that is happening. And I really think there is room for us to continue offering mutual aid and being the change we want to see and building up from the grassroots, building power, because necessarily the cavalry is not coming and no one is going to save us meaning those who have been marginalized and continue to be, but rather we have to band together and save ourselves and kind of crowdsource that change. So I think whether we think of how to encourage or sustain or flourish, it's going to be a peer-to-peer effort. I think as far as preservation, we've seen where preservation takes this approach of this building is in disrepair and it is blighted and it is threatened and we have to intervene instead of seeing an opportunity to kind of build up and preserve what was there as opposed to kind of move everything out and banish and put up walls and put up red tape and say like no one can go here because the building comes before the people. I feel like my same approach to museums. It is community over collections. It is people over property. We have to center people in all these struggles, and in centering people in the preservation work and the museum work and the archival work, how do we root that community engagement, that asset mapping, that spatial liberation, all the things that can help preserve places that have been disinvested and disinherited and disenfranchised by these systemic policies and processes of under-resourcing and undermining these places, whether they don't have infrastructure or they do. Often places have tight-knit communities where people have a solid opinion about what can and should be preserved and what is historic and what is memorable about that site, and how do we honor that as opposed to saying, okay, wealthy white preservationist who knows historic tax credits and all of the ins and outs, they're going to come in and save the day, but letting the people choose, letting the people decide, because at the end of the day, this pandemic is affecting people and our work is supposed to be about people.
Thank you, Monica, so much. And so I have two more questions and we're going to do kind of a rapid kind of fire. The next one is quickly unpacking. I don't know how you quickly unpack this, but the title of this session, Preservation by All for All, right? What does it mean, to uncover these stories? What does it mean to update these narratives? But I guess the quick fire part of this is, when it says to remove barriers so that everyone has a seat at the table. What does that look like to you, right? The last part, because I was really like, what does the table look like? What does the room look like? What do the chairs look like, right? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean when we're looking to hopefully, in looking at more just futures ahead, right? How would you reconfigure the table? Given what we have talked about today. And so first I would like to invite Ty. Or, sorry, Ty, I know that you're at work.
Sorry, my boss just walked in. It's all good. So I would, the thing that is biggest for me is that I really am, like, when I get invited to something like this, one of the first things I do is I look at who else has been invited to speak on the same panel with me. And if it's a bunch of white people, I'm like, maybe we all shouldn't be talking. Maybe you should be talking to these other folks instead. So I usually, I'll give up my seat at the table because as a white person, people have heard from white people enough. And it's time for other voices to be given at the table. So if you, especially there's like 300 people watching this or so, if you're a white person and you get invited to something like this, are you really the best person to be seated at the table? Could you give voice and give your spot to somebody else who could be able to have words to say that are much more impactful than what you could say? And I think that's the main way I approach it.
Thank you, Ty. Sarah, what does the table look like for you?
Okay, this is a complicated question, but so to uncover stories, to update narratives, it means that things we already know, because in many cases our communities already know these things, have to be made public, and the public has to be willing to hear it. That I think is such a big barrier, is that, we can keep shouting, this matters, and then we're like, that's an activist, activist. And while I might want to embrace the term activist, I know that that's often a dismissive term, a way of saying that's not a preservation professional, or that's, not because I'm a public historian, so I don't have a university affiliation. I don't know that so many people care, but at the same time, I can't tell you how many times I've just been dismissed as, oh, she's an activist. So we know these things. We have the knowledge. We need ways to make that knowledge public, and for the public to actually listen. That's hard. That last part is really hard. You put it out there, you hope for the best, but will they really listen? In terms of removing barriers, I would just say that I think a lot of this does come down to class, at least in the work that I've been involved in. So much of this happens at a grassroots level, where you have this sort of mixture of people, very few of whom have, what might be seen as like professional standing in that field, or in some cases maybe, but we're relying on a lot of community knowledge. And so there tend to be these class barriers. Here in San Antonio, we have challenges with access to things like preservation boards, who's on the preservation boards, over and over again. Things that I have taken to the preservation board here have been politely, listened to, but then not approved, basically because there's a disconnect oftentimes, at least in my location, between our architecture and culture. And so if it's not high architecture, there's not a lot of interest in the cultural story behind it. And so that to me is a huge barrier. So if you are a person of color with interest in preservation or already actively working in preservation, try to get a seat on those boards, because they have a lot of power to make decisions. At the state level here, I know we're battling a bill that would make it even harder for municipalities to have control over local designation. This just sort of the state wants to be able to say what works for all municipalities, which I think is not right. Different cities are different towns are different. And certainly the ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic makeup of different areas is different. And so we need to be always sensitive to that. This is something that I think we've been struggling with for a long time in terms of, for years, right? For at least 20 years, people have been talking about diversifying preservation. And there are people in the field doing the work, people like you, Michelle. There are these people out there. I just think that, unfortunately, it's not well known within the field. So it's important that we have people like you in universities to try to make the change there. It's important that we have people at the grassroots level to make the change at that level too. We have to be attacking this from all sides.
Thanks.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
I got a great breakdown, a great analogy, right? The room, the table, the seat. The room, the table, the seat. Removing barriers so that everyone has a seat at the table. So to me, the room is the problem. It is the dominant power structure. It is the way things are and always were. The table is the process. Ideally, a new process. How can we change the status quo? And the seat is this pivot to solutions, this invitation. So what does it look like to have a seat at the table? It's an invitation to change the status quo. Now, certainly, if all status quos could be changed, what a beautiful world it would be. But this is a chance, right? It doesn't mean it will happen. It doesn't mean it has to happen, but it is an invitation to bring your ideas, to bring the breadth of your lived experience, to bring all of your fierceness to that table and say, hey, table, I know, right? I get it. I know you all have always done it the way you always will, but now is the moment to pivot. Here's a chance to explore solutions, and let's explore what we can do to be more equitable in our operations with this seat that you have given me and or the people that I represent. And hopefully, I will say in terms of seats at the table, I have been at many tables where many other Black, Brown, and Indigenous persons have not been, but I am tired of the same people getting picked for those tables, right? Yes, invite me, but also invite others. And I'm going to give you a list of those who are emerging, those who are seasoned, those who are retired, those who were never considered, because all of them need to be at the table too. And it shouldn't just be the same voices, the same people, the same expected outcomes. True change and true equity comes from hearing all voices, considering all previous disadvantages and accounting for that and remedying that. And so I feel like that's super important in this equation, the seat at the table meaning an invitation to change the status quo. I also will say that removing barriers means nothing about us without us, which is a kind of famous activist saying, and I don't see activists as a bad thing. Call me an activist any day. I totally embrace that identity. I mean, it depends, who is saying it and how they're saying it. But, if we have this system that privileges the loudest voices, the powerful voices, the richest voices, those who know the law and have the time to attend the community meetings and the forums, how do we make sure to keep special interests out of preservations, museum, public history, et cetera, and center community voices, first voice, Indigenous voices, community advisory committees in the process, because they truly represent the community. That also means that accommodations need to be made in order to be equitable, because as was said earlier, those people are often working or busy or may not have overcome the digital divide. But again, if we're going to give invitations, they need to be equitable in nature. There need to be new people who are surfaced, and we need to realize that the status quo ultimately is what has to change.
Amen. Monica. I also have been fortunate. I'm going to go back off of Sarah and Monica, right? Sarah, it's not only about, being at the table in the community, in the boardrooms, right? For me, a lot of my work, my dissertation was on the National Park Service and their heritage initiatives. And it was like going into the Department of the Interior, was just like, how do people get in here? Right? Like, how do you get invited? Even though they're like, it's a public building. I was like, yeah, but someone needs to sign you in, right? To vouch for you. And that's very powerful, right? Like, how do you even get into the Department of the Interior, right? Not just as a visitor, right? But how do you get in as an advisor, as an expert, as a person working there, right? May you be a career staff or an appointed person in an appointed position, right? And so where are those tables located is another question that I often ask. And I remember during the Obama administration, I was very fortunate to work a lot in collaboration with the National Park Service and other, SHPOs and local agencies, really thinking about expanding preservation. And like Monica, being the only person of color, right? I was like, this is weird, because then you're going to ask me to speak on behalf of Black, people and communities and works, right, in places. I don't know that much. I'm not the expert in that. But I also, was just like, so, it's not only how do you get a seat at the table, but like, I'm just like, if the door can be opened for me, I'm going to kick open that door, prop it open, and invite everyone else to come in, right? And there might not be enough seats, but we'll find places, right? And we don't need to sit down, we can stand up, right? And maybe even, like if you want to just take this, analogy even further, for people who maybe from the disabled community, they don't need a chair. If they're like, if they utilize a wheelchair, right? They have their own seat, they'll bring it with them, right? Like, so how do we even bring our own chairs, and how do we kick open the door? I think it's like, just give us the address and we'll show up, right? If you want to take it that way. And so, I think this allows us to think about the last question. What one piece of advice would you pass along, not only to the next generation, but as we've been talking about, those who, didn't think that they would, or don't consider themselves preservationists or are interested in learning more, so they're not necessarily the next or the young generation, but just anyone who's just, just seeking kind of, advice and feedback on where do we go next as preservationists, little p. And so I would like to invite Sarah first.
Well, of course, women are powerful, but I also want to say that sometimes we need a break. And so it's always important to remind yourself that you don't have to do everything. You can sometimes say no, or you can recommend somebody else. I know there's a lot of pressure, and oftentimes there's just this sense of, I want to help. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to give everything of yourself away. So I think if I could just give one piece of advice, it's that you don't have to do everything, and you can still be a good member of your community.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for the reminder of self-care. Very, very important. Sarah says this to me in my emails. She always ends it like, please take care of yourself, or find some rest and joy over the weekend, right? And I take that when Sarah ends her emails with me. So next I would like to invite Monica. What piece of advice would you like to share?
This is advice for the next generation, for us. Who?
I mean, it's supposedly the next generation, but I mean, just for anyone, just
for the
advice.
road.
Yeah.
Get enough sleep. Let's see. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like there is just all of this tension and trauma we are enduring. Everyone means well, most people, and then yet things don't change, outcomes don't shift. So I just feel like being a person of your word, and if you're going to have conversations, as this whole like having conversations industrial complex where everything's a conversation on a conversation, but the action doesn't happen, like be committed to action, right? Have your conversation, talk to your board staff, stakeholders, external, internal, and then think about what can we actually do to change this so that this time next year, maybe we're having a different panel discussion.
Thank you, Monica. And then Ty?
Yeah, so I echo all the things that have already been said, but also find your cohort and listen to others. So one of the things that really got me through sort of all the work and also through the pandemic was through having friends in the pandemic and in the community who sort of understood what we were all going through. And so it was really sometimes of like, oh my gosh, this person said this on Twitter, or this person is having this bad take. And I just like, sometimes you need to vent with other people. And it's really because they'll support you. And then when they're having a bad time, you support them. And so we're really supporting ourselves, because a lot of these, especially preservation, can be full of microaggressions and macroaggressions that really take it out on your mental health. And sometimes you need people who are there who are there in your corner and who can also help you fight against the systems that we're all trying to slowly dismantle, or in some case, dismantle with a battering ram. And also listen to others. You're not always right. And it's really important to listen to other people, especially your community members, especially your other colleagues, because you don't have all the answers all the time. And you can always, we're all lifelong scholars. We can all continue to keep learning and listening from other people, getting other people's perspectives from a large rainbow, as it were, of backgrounds and perspectives can really help inform your work, and it can help you inform how you approach things in your everyday life, but as well as in practice.
Thank you, Ty. And building off of what everyone is saying, for me, it's about mentoring. Mentoring is not like a, top down kind of approach, right? Mentoring, it can be done mentoring up, mentoring down, mentoring side to side, right? Like mentoring in many directions, and it doesn't have to be just, two people, right? It's not just like a dual relationship. It could be multi-generational, right? Kind of mentoring. It can be just, every other configuration we can think of, right? And so mentoring means just always supporting, and I think that mentoring is a way, however that looks like, right? How we need to be just, supported and held, is something it's a lifelong relationship, right? It's a commitment. It's not like I'm going to mentor you for 3 months and then see you later, right? Because that's my commitment. But I've been really fortunate to have really good mentors inside and outside of preservation who have said, I'm going to commit, to being in a mentoring relationship, right? There's a sense of reciprocity. And, particularly for me, I think it's even tied to self-care, right? And saying like, we can't have the ability to say yes to everything, but also like, how amazing would it be to have more voices? And so for me, it's like, if you look at API HIP's board composition, no one works for like a foundation or a major corporation, right? It's not that traditional composition. Rather, these are folks who have been on the ground doing work, or who are young students who are like, I'm really interested. And actually kind of our rite of passage is we have an biannual convening, we call our national forum. And it's all volunteer led, right? And it's kind of the way that's like the baptism by fire. Like if you can plan a forum with us and get to know our crazy family, and that if you're just as like nutty and crazy as us, and that you still like us by the end of it, like we, not always, but there are folks we invite to be on our board. So it's multi-generational, folks who are retired to folks who just are finishing grad school or finished it, and even that is like with the younger folks, like we ask what people can give. We don't have a certain dollar amount that the board members are supposed to raise every year. Rather, what does giving mean, right? And we really expand on that. And that, particularly for the younger preservationists on our board, it's us supporting them for them to have on their resume or CV that they sit on a board. I mean, that really gives them that access and credibility, that many of us who were younger maybe didn't have, right? And it gives them, and it's an amazing to see that they're just like, I'm on the board, right? And so they really, I can lean to them when I'm like, I'm tired, I can't say yes to everything, but can I lean to you, right? How can we support each other as a community? And some of my board members are like, I can say your speech, Michelle, like your pitch, like the back, like it's like mine, because I've seen it so many times, right? And I was like, I think that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? So if I can turn to you to be that voice when I can't be there, right? How can we support each other? And so I think mentoring is key. I think there's been questions of just like, how do we, break through, what has been traditionally, white dominated field of preservation, right? It's to say to the younger folks, like, you belong here too. Not just younger in terms of age, but younger in terms of maybe experience or exposure to the field. And so, yes, I'm going to now we have less than 15 minutes. We have 14 minutes left. There's some questions in the Q&A. So for any of my panelists, if you want to answer by typing in, you can. But I think there was one question of just like, if there was one thing you wish more people knew about your specific areas of preservation, right? What would that be? Because I think we all come from very, different backgrounds, but also different, like where we situate ourselves in the field of preservation. So anyone want to share, what do you wish more people knew about your specific area of preservation?
I can just share one thing real quick. The number of historic sites at a national level that have been recognized that are connected to the history of either African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, teeny tiny, like less than 2%. And yet, I hope that doesn't discourage people too much, because the reality is there are BIPOC working in historic preservation, trying to improve those numbers. So it's not that we don't exist, okay? So if you want to do a project to increase diversity in historic sites in your community, try to find a person of color to help you with that, because there are people in the preservation world who can do consulting work, who can help you with nominations. It would just be very meaningful if you could hire a person of color to help you with that. But yeah, so we exist, we do exist. And yeah, most communities haven't done a great job of designating sites connected to this history, but there's no reason we can't change that.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, we do exist. And I often say to folks, preservation is about long game, right? Like we all know, just preservation in general, to save a building, to restore it or whatever, right? To renovate it, it takes years to designate it, right? I know Little Tokyo National Historic District took 14 years, and I think they estimated over $13 million to get the designation in 1996, right? And I often tell my students, can you imagine like what happened in the 14 years? And so preservation and social justice actually have the one big thread I see is it's a long arc of change. Incremental steps matter. And that sometimes you don't know when you hit the end, right? Necessarily. But after a while, you get to see, when you stay committed to that work, you get to see what happens to the seeds you sowed, right? And there are long winters, right? But there are also beautiful springs when we go through this work in preservation. So anyone else would like to share what you wish more people knew about your specific area in preservation? Okay. If you think about that, let me know. And I'm scrolling through all the questions. So I think there's some questions about the pandemic and how has it changed the work you do? I think, some of us have started to talk about it as it's given us pause, but also kind of given urgency to the work we do. So can any of you speak to how has the pandemic affected your work? And potentially any positive takeaways from this time?
I mean, I will say that the kind of dual pandemics of the racial reckoning that started long back, that has got prominence in the summer of 2021 and that continues, has made a lot of my work pivot to working on anti-racism, statement crafting, equity, diversity, inclusion. And so to me, that is now part of, or should be part of, every project should be mainstreamed and not so much novel. I know that a lot more organizations, historic sites and beyond are creating, statements of acknowledgement and land acknowledgements. And I would just encourage that to continue. And I hope that when whatever verdict happens, hopefully, and beyond verdicts, hopefully people won't say like, oh, thank God we solved that, but we'll still lean in to ways that they can be accountable and acknowledge and honor those who came before and the injustices happening now.
Thank you, Monica. Anyone else would like to share? How has this last 12 months, changed your work? Any positive takeaways? Sure. Go ahead, Ty.
I think one good thing like you were talking about earlier is that sometimes you can lean on other people. So I know for me, I had a very rough year. I moved 3 times and I was underemployed or unemployed for 6 months. And so I was having a very hard time with my mental health and other things. And so, but other groups in the city, it's not just me doing preservation work in Washington, D.C. around the queer community. There are lots of other people. And so other groups were also doing the work. So, so while I was sort of having to take some time to myself, sort of regroup and sort of pick up the pieces of my life, there were other groups doing the work. So you don't have to soldier through if you're having a hard time. You can take care of yourself, and it's really important to do so.
Thank you, Ty, for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's given, and I think we've touched on this a few times already in this session about it's been a practice of compassion, right? Not only for others, because I feel, I don't know, for me personally, I'm like constantly giving compassion and then feeling really depleted by the end of the day or by the end of the week, by the end of the year, right? Or just like taking that time to just be like, I need to take care of myself so that I can continue on, right? But I also we need to recognize when we can lean on to others, right? To say, I need help, or can you help, with the work that I'm trying to work through, right? To take in that space. So, I think, thank you for sharing that, Ty. I think one big takeaway, I think we've modeled it at the top of this session, right? One, we're all on Zoom, which was impossible, like to get my board to get on. before last year, right? I would always host my board's national. So I would always ask them to go on Zoom, and I'd be the only one. Everyone else is like, didn't know how to turn on the cameras. They're all called in, right? And so it's amazing. Zoom has allowed us to see each other virtually. And then also just like us practicing, like what are our preferred pronouns, right? I mean, it was happening already, but, I think it's become more of an open practice that we keep seeing, and as well as the land acknowledgements, right? We're able to name our experiences that we're living through in the moment, and that it's, we're not robotic, right? I think we become more expanded in how we name our work and how we are positioned in it. So, I think just even today's session, we've been able to demonstrate how we as society have evolved, hopefully, right, to see each other a little more personally in our work. So I'm going to search if there's another question. Oh, this is a good one. So are there any other organizations or groups that really excite you or that you wish people knew more about? And not just organizations, I expand that out to like projects, right? That are going on that you would love to share with the audience as our last question. Sarah?
Well, I'll just tell you, there are a bunch of small organizations around the country that are doing work to preserve Latino heritage within their community. So, for example, in Dallas, there's the Dallas Mexican American I'm sorry, I think I'm going to get their name right. It's DMAHL, Dallas Mexican American Historic League, I think is their name. I apologize if I got that wrong, y'all. But they're on Facebook, and then there's another one called the Tamale Festival, which is in California. And I know it sounds like, well, they just celebrate tamales, but but they actually are trying to preserve a place in California, an old adobe structure. You can follow them. There's Los Descendientes in Tucson, Arizona. People who, their families have been in Tucson for a long time and experienced a big push of their family out of a historic Mexican-American community when the interstate came through. I know a very common story in communities of color. But there are these little groups around the country doing these very cool things. And so, if you start following some of them, like on Instagram, it'll recommend some of the other ones for you. I want to acknowledge all of those little groups, and I'm sure I don't even know about all of them, but I know that there are these people doing this work at the grassroots level, and it is so important for getting to that point to tell this national story.
Thank you, Sarah. And I know we're sharing as also our links on the chat. Any Monica or Ty, any projects you want to elevate?
I'll elevate a group that I admire, have been following. The group is called Black Space. It's blackspace.org. And they are a group that brings together planners, architects, artists, designers, urbanists, preservationists who are passionate about a presence for Black people, Black spaces where Black culture matters and thrives. They have a manifesto and they have chapters around the country. And so I think they're doing dynamic work. Also adjacent, but not quite in preservation, is the Arts Administrators of Color Network, which is a network for folks of color who work in kind of arts administration, culture, history. Again, the group that I'm the co-founder of, Museum Hue. And I feel like there's a lot of groups that are just kind of forming to hold space for one another, whether that's skill building or just moral support. But I would start with those.
Awesome. And Ty?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely want to give a uplift on the Black Lesbian Archives, which is really focusing on the collection of Black lesbian heritage throughout, not just, I think they're based out of Atlanta, but they're collecting everywhere nationwide, and they're currently crowdfunding for like a heritage bus. So if you have the money, please support them, as well as the Latinx History Project, which does similar work, and also Dismantle Preservation, which sort of it does and holds conversations like we're having. And there's a conference coming up in July that specifically focuses on graduate students. So
Thank you, Ty. And I dropped some links to API HIP, just so we're on Facebook. But also there's the Asian Americans in Washington, D.C. is doing a historic context statement through the D.C. Preservation League. And we're doing it through community workshops online. We had to pivot to virtual. And there's also the Japanese American Confinement Sites Organization. These are folks that are organizations that are funded through a National Park Service grant, but they've taken it beyond the grant and have created this coalition that's doing amazing work, including the halting of, they're sending out a letter today to eBay to stop the selling of Japanese American artifacts associated with Manzanar Historic Site that is going on sale this week. And so these are just some great projects that are happening. So I'm going to wrap up in the last minute. I want to thank Ty, Sarah, and Monica for such an amazing session. It was a nice discussion to just chat with all of you and just hear all the amazing work that each of you are doing and supporting and elevating. I hope that I get to see each of you, all of you in person sooner than later. Right. And so I want to thank you again for sharing your wisdom, experience, and talent. I want to thank the Smithsonian American History's Women's Initiative and the National Society for the Colonial Dames of America. And thank you for all attending. Thank you.